Hey, so you probably know I do enjoy sound design on this machine. It is a sampler at heart and it's got a bunch of tools in there that we can manipulate and control our sound, and with the tracker workflow we can make some really interesting sounds. But today I've got 5 of my sort of favorite tips that are not really apparent inside the box but really are powerful and a lot of fun to play with in certain circumstances. So enough with the intro, let's get straight into it. We know the Polyend tracker is a sampler and we do need to play with samples, and sometimes we get a sample that we really enjoy but it's a little bit too short, and like in the case here it's extending out, but when we play with high notes, because of how the tracker pitches, you heard it cut out there. So this is a really cool way to sort of extend out our notes by creating a basic loop. And I just wanted to highlight just my way of doing this because everyone's got their own way of setting up loop points and that, but I think just being able to showcase it. So what I like to do is I usually set to a forward loop first because I want to hear a click, and then I just set the start and end loop point. So you just select these two somewhere where it's not going to change too much, so you can hear that click there, and it's got a bit of an up ramp. So what I might do is just move it. So we got a click, and what I do now is just zoom right in because we can press the buttons and we can see what we're doing. And what I want to try and do is create a loop point that looks like these two parts are pinched up, but they mirror each other at the end. So what I'm going to do, this start loop point, is I just bring it so you hear there's less click there. And because I can see this sort of waveform here, I'm just going to pick a point that's going to be close. So I might pick that one. So when it comes out, it'll be going down, and then when it's leaving, it'll be going up. All right, just following that sort of workflow, it does take a bit of tweaking to find something that works, and this is something I found. And sometimes those little rhythmic artifacts when you do this sort of looping, it does create some interest. So really it's about experimentation, playing with it. Sometimes you can get a really seamless loop and it works really nicely. Sometimes you get into this state and it's okay, but it's not really the best. Sometimes when you go into here, you can use a ping pong, and what this does is when you play a note, it will go through but it will come back and forth as well. So it tries and masks that sort of clicky sound. But when you do something like this, and if we go back to pattern, so it's just a way that we can create these sort of loop points. And if you want to take it a bit further, so when it comes to these sort of looping waveforms, we can actually create something that's called a single cycle waveform. So I'm just going to move these two over here, and you can hold both buttons to just scrub across. What I want to do is find something that's super small right up the start, and I might want to capture this waveform here. So I'm just going to move that loop point to there, and then scroll all the way through. So we're capturing one frame, and then I just want to move the start so we're not getting any other sort of stuff. And these little single cycle waveforms, it creates its own oscillator, and these can be really interesting to try and make new sounds with. So I just thought I'd put this in here about looping because these are the sort of things that make their interesting sounds. So if let's see what I can do and play with this one. And just with a few little tweaks, I was able to make something from that single cycle waveform. So it's definitely a big area to explore with trackers. Alright, I think we had enough about the oscillators and how we can control this, but I've got another waveform in here. This one is more of a riser sound, so if I was playing along, I want that sound to build in, but really when it comes to the instrument parameters, like we have seconds, so if we look at how these are done, that's like 0.3 of a second and that. So how do we sync something up? And I think this first way is a lot easier. I'll have a different way where it's using a little bit more of some of the tracker granular functionality here. But what we want to do is we want to calculate this number here. So I'm just going to set it up. So we got a build up, it cuts off when it's done, so you just need to release a key and that's it. So if we come into our pattern and say I want to start this build up from 32 and go down to like say 64, I start from 0, so just indexing, but I'll go back to 32 here and I want to play my note, so start there, and if I hit play from here, so we can hit shift play, and it's going to pick up from there. So putting the note down, what I'm trying to do is calculate how long my thing should be by looking at this number here. So it's got the seconds there, so if I go shift and play from this position, I'm just waiting by eye when I cross that finish line. So we'll probably stop, but I'd say about 3.5 seconds. So I'm just going to go back into my instrument parameters and I'm just going to set that to 3.5, maybe 3.6. We'll see how it goes. So we'll go back down to that point. And we're watching, so it finished a little bit too early, so we want to give it more. So we can just sort of tweak it a little bit. That felt like it finished on the line as well. And you can do this in reverse, so if you wanted to create like a faller using a noise sample, you would do the reverse, but instead of using attack, you would use the decay. But like programming all this, figuring all this bits out, it's a bit annoying, but when we've done it this way, we can actually just copy this block around. So usually when I'm doing risers and fallers, if anyone's seen my tracks, I usually have everything that's to relate to song structure over here. So if there's any groove commands or anything like that, this is where it lives, and then I can just visually see that is the riser. So that's one way I like doing it. But the second way, because like say we want to pitch the noise, we can sort of do that here, but we start making it a little bit higher. So the sound's going to cut out, and really we could do that trick again where we create like a forward loop and like do the noise that way. But another way we can do it where we can sort of live control the pitch is by setting this to the granular. So if you've never dealt with a granular synth before, they sort of create this grain that you scrub across the audio. So if I was to just do that, but we'll set its position as I play. So right now it's scrubbing across the audio, but what we want to do is probably change the length a bit so we can see that grey line thickening up. So that's the grain that we're sampling. So this is how we're capturing the sound, but what I want to do is set this about midway, and this takes a little of finessing to get right. But if we go back into the instrument parameters, I want to go to that granular position, and then I can set it to that LFO as well. So we know that it's 3.8, so what I want to do is set this to 3.8 here, and we'll just turn everything else off and we'll go with the amount. So if we come back into the sample playback and play a note, it's going to start from there. So sometimes it'll add to either side. So with our LFOs, it'll add to either side, but because it's going to start from there, we'll just scrub this back. We'll change that to a gauze. Add some rhythmic flavor, but it means like any note that we play, it's always going to be that scrubbing. So we could have like, and it's just like one sample, just granular setup, and we're tweaking the, like we're doing real time time stretching, but this creates some really interesting sound. So we could shrink this down again. And this is how we start building our riser texture. So I thought this is a really interesting technique to teach people, but this is really useful if you want to start tweaking notes and like having note lengths different and that. So really interesting technique. So definitely have a look at this one. Alright, we've got something that's a little bit interesting here, but you might get to this point where it's like, hey, not too long ago in another project, I made some really cool instruments that I want to play again and bring them into this one. But you might think that you need to take the SD card out, plug it into your computer, take those instruments, put them into the instrument folder, plug it back in, and then you can start doing the Polyend thing where you go in here, you go, oh, I want to bring an instrument in, and you can only limit it to those files. But this is a bit of a sneaky trick that I think more people should know about, because this is a root directory and we can go to any point or any file. So there's a bit of caveat to this one, but if we go into project files, and I am going to go into my organized project, so I spent a bit of time correlating everything together. And I'm just going to pick this one and go into instruments, and hey look, we've got some instruments loaded, so I can sort of preview like the actual sample itself. So what I might do is, I know this is my really cool wub bass, so I'm just going to add, we bring it in, maybe we want that second one, and we go add, and that is a really cool way to steal from another project. So what this has made me do now, because you probably notice as we go along, if I come back to the start, get it out here, instrument creation. I actually have a bunch of working files now on the Polyend tracker where I have like a sound design session and just start making instruments just for instruments' sake around ideas. So like the oscillator pack you probably know about. But this is how I've been building instruments and then being able to play them live. And then if I find out if I have instruments that I really enjoy using, then usually what I try and do is break them out and make a sort of instrument pack from them. So it's like oscillator pack, or I've got my kick drums. So really it's like fine tuning your samples down to like a really select group of sounds, and that's where you start getting into your own iconic sound. And really when I figured out this pipeline of like, I can build samples in projects to use in other projects, or instruments I should say, this has really improved my workflow. So I thought I'd highlight that one in this video. Alright, so the next little tip that I wanted to bring up is sort of like how numbers sort of stack on top of each other with the Polyend tracker, because understanding this allows you to make more dynamic instruments that you can control a little bit better. And really, I'm working on this bass line here. I'm starting to do a little bit of work with the cutoff, and I just wanted to show like some of the ways I've done it. So we have the cutoff A here, so if we so we can control it that way, but we use the instrument parameters to add some like automation on top. So and this is a really interesting way to work, but what I wanted to bring up here is how this number isn't like it multiplies it and creates a different number. It's all adding on top of each other. So if I was to come into here, it's pretty aggressive, but if I start driving it up, you hear how the number gets slammed up into the top, and then the cutoff frequency sort of brings up. So it's a range, but this number here adds on top. So if we set this to about 50%, and then say we can use this as sort of like a dynamics control. We have a lot more range of sounds that we can sort of hear, because this one isn't constantly being slammed up into the roof. So it's just a different way of thinking, but you can get, like, if you want that sound, you definitely do it, but So this is another way to just add a little bit more dynamics to the sound, and like, especially if you're doing this with LFOs, like you can have like a really syncopated bass and then you can like push it in so it's like maxing out and there's like no room for like any sort of sound. It really does add a lot more control to it. And if you're working in the tracker workflow, like you can sort of live play it by coming in here and doing this, but sometimes we don't have all the hands to work with. So what I usually like to do is I'm just going to fill, and now I'm going to put in a low pass command from 2 somewhere about there, each step 1, yep. Going by each step so it doesn't have like a steppy sound because the notes itself is when it's pulsing. But if we were to play that, and that is taking control over this number here. But another thing I've noticed is, say we wanted to add a high pass to this, we can go fill constant, we'll pick the high pass here, constant from 2, do something like, I think it's in reverse, we'll try that way. Because the instrument has the low pass activated, this will control that number, but because we are applying a high pass to it, this is a separate number that is applied on top of the entire instrument. So you can create some sort of interesting little band pass things going on here. So I just wanted to show those off because this is a really cool technique to like just create instruments that you can control just as easily by putting in a few commands to make them work. Alright, we're up to the last tip of this video, and I think this one is for a very particular person with a very particular use case, but I think people get a kick out of this one because it adds a lot of new cool things that you can do with a tracker. And this really comes down to, like, I like making these sort of like syncopated basses, and this is just through the LFO and cycling it so much. And then what I'll do is I'll use FX commands to control it and then like jump around and create some really interesting LFO automation. But with the Polyend tracker, one thing I would really like to see is to have some sort of phase command. So saying here where it's like, instead of like when the LFO starts here, I actually want the LFO to start here so I can create some really interesting rhythms. But we don't have a sync on here, and really how the Polyend tracker syncs is when you hit that play button, whether that's here or in the song mode and you hit play up here, that is the starting point of every LFO. So everything's going to follow cascading down. So when I make my LFO rhythms, I'm always making sure that I start from here, so I'm getting a sense of what the rhythm's going to be. But how do we add phase to our tracker? So this requires a little bit of math and understanding, but what we're doing is creating a multiplication or a division so we can sort of hit that half time as it cascades down. So this one's hitting the point, and say I want to make this LFO start down here. And what we can do is we'll come up here, we're going to pick an FX command to help us bump the sound. But what we need to do is, if we are at say 4 steps, so every 4 steps as we cascade down, we sort of want to double the speed so one cycle happens in 2 steps. And how the Polyend tracker handles this is, like, as you say 2 steps, it will do 2-step cycles, so you're not doing like crazy math, be like, oh, I need to speed it up by 2, so that would be like 8 and all that sort of stuff. So you just select the 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit record, and I want to select that filter LFO because that's what I'm controlling. Go there, and then for this one I want to set that back to 4. So if I was to just play it per verbatim for what it was, so they're both hitting at the same time, but if I was to just undo that, you're hearing it bounce left and right. And really you're not just limited to, like, I just set this to a 4 on the floor and then did like a double speed to get it both so it's out of phase 50%. Like, there's so many ratios and so many interesting things that you can do, especially with syncopated rhythms. So this sort of phase jump, it does add a little artifact here, but for me, it doesn't really jump out as hard. It does get it into that phase sort of state. So if you're really looking at having a Polyend tracker and being able to control the phase of the LFO, this is the way to do it. So I hope you found something useful in this one. You might not have seen any of these before, or you know a fair bit about them, but definitely give them a go. If you like them, use them. If you don't, well, you gave it a shot and had it go. So really this one was just to highlight those little obscure things that really don't come apparent inside the box, but really, like, especially that phase shift, that is something I've wanted for a long time. So I've been mulling over how to get it into this thing, and it does add a lot of rhythmic flavor. So if you like this one, definitely give it a thumbs up, because it does tell the algorithm to point this to other people that are probably looking to do some sound design on the tracker itself. And if you do have any comments or queries, please feel free to leave them down below. I do try and talk more about these subjects and keep them inside the video, or keep them around the video itself. So if you do, thank you so much. And if you enjoyed this one, I do have a fair bit of tracker content on this channel here, so if you're looking for more for that, I look forward to seeing you next time.